And ladies and gentlemen, we're live. Okay, so let's make sure that I believe that the tweeters should have tweeted. So we have to retweet the tweet. Let me see if I can find that for JS Jabber. I think when we hit the go live button, it's supposed to send out our. There it is. Okay, good. Yep, it did. Okay, so I'll give you all the tweet and you can retweet it. And then we'll go ahead and get things started. So I'm putting this into, let's see, where's our chat? I'm putting it into our private chat, which I guess I didn't really have to. I could have just put it in the other one as well, but all the same. All right, so retweets if you got them. Right and on. Then I'll go ahead and get us started here. So, hello, and welcome back, lovely listeners, for another exciting episode of JavaScript Jabber. Today on our show, we have myself as host, AJ O'Neill, Steve, our dad joker.
What up coming from?
No.
Uh-oh.
Frozen.
That's weird. Oh, okay, now it's replaying all at once. Technical difficulties, but Steve's here. I'm sure that the stream will get but it'll just work itself out. And then we have I'm trying to find your last name now, Zach. Zach writes code. Yep. Last name writes code.
That'll work.
That's what it says. That's what I'm going with. Go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us what you're here for.
Yeah, my name is Zach Lankton, or Zach Writes Code in this case, and software developer. I've been writing code for 15 some odd years, probably more than that. Everything from C, maybe a little assembly, all the way to like JavaScript and HTML and things of that nature. Front end, back end, not afraid of any of it. I like DevOps. I do a little bit of DevOps in my daytime job, and I'm a containerization zealot, a bit of a Kubernetes enthusiast, but I'm very beginnerish on that. Husband and a father, and recently in my very limited free time, a front-end framework author.
That's good because we don't have enough of those.
Yeah, right? We need more of that.
Well, my first question is actually going to be, if I can just got something on my tongue there. Yeah. Okay, my first question is actually going to be, I see that you offer hosting services. That is unusual. Like, just about every guest we've ever had has some framework for the front end thing that they've written, but not all of them offer hosting. So will you tell me a little bit about that? Just as like a unique thing about you.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting that you asked that because nobody uses that service except for my previous company that I worked for. They're the only ones who leverage, basically I have one server in a data center that I own, and then some that I don't own that, for failover and things of that nature. And so I think a couple of years ago, maybe 3 or 4 now, I just started trying to build that website, which I haven't updated in probably about that long. And that was one of those things that I put on there. I was like, hey, if you're looking for this, send me an email, we'll chat, and maybe I can offer you some hosting services, try to help you out with your project. But most of that is geared toward doing like building things for, a client or a contractor or customer, as far as like, hey, they've got this thing they want to build. And that's what I have. This one customer, I built a custom ERP system for them, and I host it. So they've been using that for 5-10 years now. So yeah, I nerd out a little bit on the DevOps side of things, and I always wanted to have my own server in the cloud, if you will, one that I owned and that I maintained. And so that's where that comes from.
So is it Proxmox? Is
yes.
that what you're using? Okay,
yeah.
Cool. All right.
Yeah,
I also am using Proxmox on a 4-server cluster with high
Nice.
availability and all that.
Yeah,
So
you're
that's
further along than I am because I've just got the one server. No, it's not a cluster at all.
well, we bought on eBay
Yep.
the last gen servers that were being dumped, and now the next generation of last gen is just getting dumped because all of these companies, I mean, you know this stuff. Amazon's running servers that are like 15 years old, and as they
Yeah.
offload them, they eventually end up on eBay. And so you can get the same technology with the same power that Amazon's running today on their servers that have been retired.
Yep.
From and so yeah, we got them super cheap. I think it was about $600 a server, $700 a server, pretty much more or less maxed out.
Yep.
And
Exactly.
so we paid less than the cost of what someone would pay for one server, and we got the cluster. And anyway, but
Yeah.
that's cool. That's cool.
Yeah. That's where it's at right there. Get them on eBay, host them yourself.
Yeah, and it's been going well for us. We've been running it a year. I've transferred almost everything. There's only 2 projects I have left that I haven't transferred, and like you, running some client stuff there as well. Hoping to open it up to the general public as well, but want to do it in an automated fashion
Yep.
when we get to that point. But yeah, anyway, so that was cool. Just to see that, and fellow Proxmox user. So
Oh yeah.
that's cool. Now, the reason that we actually have you on the show, or that Dan reached out to you, I'm happy to talk about any of it. By the way, I think that's totally fine. But Dan was thinking that Rezact was a rather timely framework to discuss. So, among the sea of front end frameworks, now we've got Rezact. Tell us about Rezact.
Oh wow. So I don't know that I picked up on that piece with Dan. He just found it interesting and wanted to talk about it. But yeah, so React is basically, it's a front end framework. It's like React in the sense that you write components using JSX. It's very at home if you've used React, and for anybody who has. But it's also like Svelte in that there's some pieces of it where it transforms the code that you write, because it's not exactly, I mean, it's all JavaScript. It's valid JavaScript or TypeScript in this case, but it transforms it into, code that does more under the hood. So like Svelte will, you do a rune or a statement that is a variable, and then all you have to do is assign things to that variable, and wherever that variable is used in the code, it'll update in the UI. And so I've taken something like that and made it, but with JSX, which was important to me because I really like JSX. I've actually really loved the templating. And I also like the fact that I can author multiple components in one file if I need to. It's pretty wide open in that regard. Whereas Svelte, there were some things about Svelte that I really liked, in that is that whole create a variable and just assign to it and it'll update where it is. But I didn't really like the authoring of the components themselves, and that it had to be one file. And I know there's a whole host of people out there who believe that you should only ever have one component in one file. And they may be right, they may be wrong. I'm not going to argue that. I just know that I like to have the flexibility, if I want to drop a separate component right in the file I'm in and not have to create a new file for it. So that's my long-winded intro. But there are other things that I've done that I think make it more interesting with the way you do state in general. And that is, a lot of frameworks, you have to download a third-party state management thing. There's not a lot of frameworks that actually give you, for like example, for like Redux or any of these other, global state management libraries. What I've come up with is a way that you can create signals anywhere, in a module, in a component, outside of a component, in a loop. So there's no like hook rules. You can create these signals anywhere. And because of that, you can just create a module that has these signals in it, import those, variables into your component, and update them from anywhere. They'll update all the places that they occur in your JSX, in the UI, etc.
So signals is a thing that is, I know it's been a recent hype train. I
Yep.
don't actually know what it means. So for background, I don't know how much of the show you watch, but my background in JavaScript is Node, and I do like stuff. The stuff that I do in the browser is like the engineering stuff in the browser, like WebSockets or like niche browser features. I don't do any of the CSS or the application state management. So I think we had someone that had talked about signals before, but I have totally forgotten what it means, and I imagine that along with many of our listeners, it's not something that has been adopted by everybody yet or that people are familiar with. So give us a rundown of what you mean by that and what the what's the benefit.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because I do think there's a lot of similarities between, like, let's say, for example, in React, you'll reach for use state in your component to manage a piece of state. But in like Preact, they've got signals, and so you'll use signal. And Svelte has signals as well. Solid has signals. All these frameworks have signals. The fundamental difference between like React, where you can throw a use state hook in your component, is that anytime you update that state, it will re-render the entire component. Whereas signals are designed to not require needing to re-render the entire component. They're designed to render or update as granular as possible the thing that is in the DOM. So for example, a text node, if you create a signal, assign it the value hello world, throw that signal variable in your JSX in a P tag or H1 tag, when you modify that variable or signal, it will automatically update the text node that it's attached to in the DOM, as opposed to trying to re-render the entire JSX component. So that's really what I think the key difference is between, like state in React versus signals.
So how is this different from the old two-way data binding, like what Angular really had its heyday with?
So that's another really good question, because I was thinking about this. I have this in Rezact where you can do this pseudo two-way data binding. But I know a lot of people are really like, oh no, that's a code smell. You shouldn't do two-way data binding anymore. We moved away from that a long time ago. And they're right, because one-way data flow has won out for a lot of really good reasons. But there's a trick involved in that it's not really two-way data binding in Rezact. And so it's different in that it is a one-way data flow under the hood. So a lot of that transformation that happens when you compile the code out will transform it into code that is very much a one-way data flow.
So the thing that's parsing the code is looking for mutation and then creating a function that calls an update routine?
Correct.
Okay.
So it has a look of two-way data binding in that you can just create a variable and you don't have to do the updates, which you can actually. So Rezact gives you that ability to step in and say, I want to take full control over that update cycle. And so you just, you can create that mechanism that will, particularly with forms, right? So inputs, you do this on change event in React that will update the state. You don't have to do that in Rezact, but you can. And as soon as you do, you now own the cycle of the update.
Okay. So here, a signal, I'm just looking at your demo code. Am I to understand correctly that a signal is just any variable that's declared with a $sign is going to get transpiled into a signal container?
Correct.
Okay. All right.
So just out of curiosity, I come from the Vue world. And so with the rewrite from Vue 2 to Vue 3, one of the big under the hood changes was using proxies, JavaScript proxies. And so I'm just curious, everything I've seen about signals, and I'm not a real under the hood guy, I'm more the top level, making the UI type of stuff. it seems like 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Is that an accurate statement when you're comparing, the proxies versus using signals?
I agree with that. And I'll start out with saying that when I wrote an early version of Rezact, I used, the proxies to. I guess I'll start off with the fact that I didn't start with this transpiler compiler, so I was trying to just make a way to write code that was nicer to write. And then eventually I ran into some obstacles and walls where I was like, that's okay, and the proxies are good. But I also saw a lot of hot code running through it, and that might just be a skill issue on my part. Like I wasn't maybe doing something right, but everything was running through this proxy like a lot. And so I went away from that, and now I'm not using proxies. I'm actually just writing or transpiling the code into getters and setters and updates and subscribers and things of that nature.
Okay. Yeah, with the two-way data binding and one-way data flow, I know like in your view, when you're in components, it's generally you have props to pass down, then you emit event. If you want to change from a child back to parent, then you emit an event, you catch the event, then you do your thing. But I know within state, within using Vuex, you can use a state, and I'm already blanking on the term, where you can have a variable that's defined in state in your component, and when you change it, it changes in state and vice versa. And it's real easy to change that. I think it's, probably one way under the hood, but it makes things very easy.
Yes.
And I do know, that you were talking about having to re-render the whole component versus just the particular variable. And what this does for you is exactly that.
Yep.
If I change a piece of state, it's just going to change it right on my screen with no update in play, or no re-rendering of the whole component.
Yep.
So, and then I'll go down another route, and this is, one of my well-beaten horses, just because it's something that I use so much, is I do a lot of that also with something called inertia. Are you familiar with inertia.js?
Not very much, no.
Okay. Short version is it's sort of a glue level between your front end and your back end, and you can plug and play your front end and your back end with, on the front end, you can use Vue, React, Svelte. On the back end, you can use Ruby, Laravel, Node, whatever. And it basically just sort of a glue layer that sits in between the two and hijacks your post request and uses some headers. And then you use all your route definition, everything else is done in your back end, and it passes everything up as props into your component. And so because it's hijacking the post request and saying, no, don't do a page reload, I'm just going to pass this data back and forth, it's crazy fast and very efficient. And then you have, it has some helper methods in there, like what's called a route visit, where you can do that. Just go, okay, I want this data from the back end. Here it comes. All I'm doing is updating my front end. So sort of another variation. And from what I gather, and we haven't gotten into the details too much, it sounds like similar to what you're doing with Rezact, in that you want to be able to just update certain things without the full page re-render because of efficiency and speed.
Yes. There is except for there is no server component at all. So I'm not, at this point, this framework's all client-side rendered, just like the old days of the original, like the way we would do React applications in the browser.
So then you're basically, depending on what standard, like GraphQL or standard REST API from your backend that you're communicating with?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So I never set out, again, because this was just kind of like a side pet project. I definitely never set out to create a full stack framework. I was just like, I want to play around with this idea that I have, and that's what became Rezact. And I'll be honest with you, I've got a lot of mileage out of client-side rendered apps, even with React. And I know that a lot of people and a lot of the solutions that have been created today around Next.js and server components and all that stuff are solving real problems. They're just not solving problems that I've ever experienced.
Are you sure they're solving real problems?
Well, I guess I'm trying to be nice about it.
I'm worn. I'm very, very worn. It just feels like, the idea, like the hope is that, we swing from one extreme to the other, and we say, okay, well, this extreme is bad, this extreme is bad. Okay, maybe somewhere in the middle is nice, but it's like we just keep on swinging from one extreme to the other with more force.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
like, no, this is like there is a middle ground that is helpful.
I actually feel the same way. I feel like the pendulum just keeps swinging, and it's gaining momentum. It's not reducing in momentum.
Yeah.
And I just find myself in the middle, quite happily in the middle, and I just develop how I develop. And so far, I haven't been in situations that required me to really dive that hard into, oh well, we need Next.js and server components. I've played around with it enough, but
I just lament it because I know that people got upset about the misconstrued sequel on the front end. I think there is some risk there in terms of just when people don't have a clear conception of where things are separated, they will eventually put something in the wrong place.
Yep.
But it's just like from my perspective, it's just been, oh man, like getting like say you got a Node package that or just you have a JavaScript package and there's nothing Node specific about it, there's nothing React specific about it, it's just JavaScript code. It's just Turing complete JavaScript code. Okay, well, you got to get it to work in Node. And then you gotta like add little hacks so that it works with Webpack. But now there's ES build. So then you gotta refine your hacks to work with ES build. And then they come out with Next, and then it breaks again. And so now in some of this code, I have like 6 lines of boilerplate on either side, and all it's doing is it's like a UMD type wrapper, but it's like I don't want to just transpile the whole file for just like using export syntax differently. Anyway, so that's where my lamentation comes from, is having figured out like the magic little one line snippet that'll work in every framework, and then Next comes out with the server side stuff, and then it gets detected as Node by the bundler, which causes it to want to use require, which causes it to not want to obey the exports, and then that sort of thing. And state management related stuff where people are doing like they're building out a call to the database, which makes the front end not like it can't be self-contained because it's got the server code in it, but all it's doing is getting an option that could have been hard coded or something like that. That's where maybe there is a use case for it, but the things I've personally encountered, I've only known that I've personally encountered them because of the weird stuff that's going on. That's like somebody just decided, I gotta do this, I gotta do it.
Yep.
But they didn't. It's like Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park, just because you could.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
I'm curious. I am curious. Why go with JSX? Well, I mean, I guess you're transpiling anyway because of the other stuff you're doing. But why JSX rather than template strings?
I've never been a huge fan of template strings, and part of that is just because probably part of it is because I've never committed fully to them. I know that there's some people out there doing that, and they really like it. I just never found that as ergonomic as just being able to write my tags right in the return, and so that's just where that comes from. It's mostly personal preference.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, ostensibly, you could still write the tags right in the return. It'd just be instead of a parenthesis, you'd be using a tick mark.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
But
no.
And hopefully they come out with the triple tick, which will preserve white space the way that you'd expect it to.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, if you use the single tick, with the code alignment, you're like, I want this component to have the white space like straight up and down where I've aligned it to the component with the indentation of the component. Problem with the single tick is that it brings in all the white space all the way to the beginning of the page.
Yep.
The triple tick spec is to make it like with the triple quotes and or the triple carets and other languages where it brings the white space to the level of indentation of the function or component or whatever.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting and really awesome. So if we get stuff like that, that would definitely be great. Because that's definitely a pain point when you're trying to maintain white space with single ticks.
Yeah, because then you almost need a transpiler just because you want your white space to look right.
Yep.
Yeah.
So Zach, probably a good idea, I think, here to sort of walk through all the stuff you highlight on the Rezact.io site.
Okay.
And if there's something else we missed, because I have some questions after perusing that and what you're talking about doing. I think I get what you're shooting for, what you're trying to do, but I just want to make sure I understand before I ask a stupid question. So, so we talked about signals, right? Was there anything more about signals and your use of signals that you wanted to address?
I guess we'd be starting into like, I think we've covered most of it, but there's a piece that I guess I want to cover a little bit of, and that is the form handling aspect. And I think we've already touched on it already. But the data binding example on form inputs, I think, is one of the things that I found I've never really cared for in React. And that is one thing that I strived to do differently in Rezact, which is to have that idea of two-way data binding where you can just create your state variable and assign it to the value of the input and not need the on-change handler. You can do that. That's an option because there's some reasons that you may want to, but it's not required. And part of the thing that has driven me the most nuts about that and why I emphasized on this is because when I realized that React was basically preventing the default action when you type in a text box, essentially, right? Because if you type in a text box that has an on-change event handler and you're not updating the state that's in the value, nothing happens inside that text box, right? And that was just wild to me. I'm like, these are browser components or inputs, elements, whatever you want to call them, that have had state management built in for as long as they've been around. They have their own state management, but React circumvents it. It says, no, we're going to circumvent it. We're going to catch your keystrokes. We're going to update the state, and then we're going to re-render the whole thing, and then we're going to update the value in that input so you see the keystroke that you hit. And that has just driven me bonkers. For mostly out of principle, it's not a performance thing because I don't think I've ever actually personally experienced a really bad performance issue with that whole cycle. But it just hurts my soul a little bit to think that all that effort is being redone in JavaScript when it's already taken care of for you in the browser. And so one thing that Rezact does is not do that, right? It will capture the keystroke and it will make sure the state is maintained, but it does not unless, of course, you add your own on-change. If you add your own on-change, then it does. It does that whole React cycle where it's like, okay, prevent default, capture your keystroke, do the thing you want me to do, update the state, re-render the value. It does all of that. But
that's what it does anyway when you do on-change in the browser in the first place.
Correct. Yeah, I guess I'm not 100% sure how it works in the actual native browser. Like, is it actually blocking, the render of the value being displayed in the input when you press the keystroke? Or does it display it and then on change happens or on input happens or whatever your event is? I don't know.
So let's see.
Because you can.
It depends. It depends on how you do it. Because there's on key up, on key down, on change, on blur, and so you can basically hijack any part of the life cycle, and you can hijack it in different places. So depending on what you're trying to hijack, you can either hijack it all the way at body.document or document.body. Some things have to be hijacked by the form. They won't propagate up all the way to document.body, so they have to be handled within the form. And then some things have to be handled within the input. So if you wanted the input to not show the keystroke that's being typed, I don't remember where that has to get handled at. It could be all the way up at document.body, but I think it would probably happen sooner than that. But you are in control. You can choose where to attach the event handler, and depending on the event, you have control of whether that key press will get displayed or not.
Yes, that is correct. And actually, as we've sitting here talking about it, I've been thinking about it. I'm like, yeah, that is basically what I believe. If you do a non-change and you just hit event prevent default, I don't think the keystroke shows up. I think that's enough. So whether or not where in that cycle that happens, I guess is different. But as long as you're not calling event prevent default, then the browser handles the life cycle of that keystroke and everything else, and you're just doing something else with it. In not necessarily in parallel because it's all synchronous, but you're not trying to take full control over that input, so to speak. So that's one thing that I wanted to point out that I find interesting about React, and has been something that just out of principle, really, I don't have any other good reason than that to take issue with it. That has just been the thing that I wanted to make sure I did differently in Rezact.
Well, I think there's a lot of thoughts here. So given that we're reaching the limit of hardware, we are, Apple's M1 was amazing, and then the M2 was 10% better, and the M3 is like another 10% better, 30% better on the things that they actually got wrong the first go around and were able to optimize. But we're not looking towards a future where every year we're having an M1 leap in CPU capability, and the laws of physics dictate that, we're at the end of the S curve. We're at the trailing end where we're approaching the limit of what computers do. So software has to get better, because software is where we can literally get tens of thousands of times more performance, especially, in the web, right?
Yep.
So when you look at the way that things have gone, it seems like component mania. And my main canonical gripe is the sign up form on a website. Like, you want to subscribe to a newsletter because you want to know when a product is going to be available or something like that, and it doesn't work. It's like you put in your email, you click submit, and it doesn't work. Like, why can't this work? And it's because, instead of having input equals email, like what you show here in your example, input type equals email, like that would work. That does the validation. You can tack on required, and it'll do all the things. But people basically, they have these components, and then instead of an input field, it's like 1,000 divs, and then every single one of those events is being re-implemented in the component stack rather than letting the browser handle it. So it seems like, we have to get back to letting the browser do what it does well, rather than re-implementing it in a way that, like literally prevents the business objective from being fulfilled, depending on, the thing, like one of the things you see most often, I don't know if you noticed this, but on an HTML form, for people that are old enough, if you hit enter, it'll submit the form, right?
Yep.
Most websites today, that won't work anymore.
Nope.
And this is because of this like componentization and the hijacking and everything. So I love seeing in your example that it's like, hey, we're going to use an input, like a literal HTML input, and we're just going to do type equals email, and that's going to do stuff for us.
Yep.
But I am a little curious about, like, so you also have this validator input, and it looks like it's exactly the same as an input. Like, there's no proprietary or API specific fields, like required is HTML, type is HTML, name is HTML, placeholder is HTML. Like, all of that's just HTML, but it's got this capital I in there to signify that it's like a special component.
Yep.
So, like, how much of the underlying HTML is it using, and what's the difference that you're using that's not HTML, and why? So
in this particular example, I am hiding a lot, right? Because obviously you're not seeing the label, but I think there's a label prop, and I'm not actually looking at the example now, and I'm not even seeing the label prop. But there is. And it will do a very simple div wrapper with a label in the input. And then, of course, the magic is that there is some events that are tied to it as far as catching your keystrokes. If you wanted to do masking, or if you're doing any kind of validation of that sort, then it will do that, in ways that the browser currently doesn't support. So like right now, I'm not aware of the browser supporting the ability to do like a phone number mask. So that's one thing that you can do with this component. And I think there's another piece where the validation, without JavaScript anyway, it's limited, right? Like you do the type email and you get a lot. But if you want to do anything more than stuff like type email, you got to branch out.
Yeah, I see the mask option, and I see the data accept. Now, HTML, I don't think it's called data accept, but it does have the option for putting in a regular expression that has some confines, but like you get regular expressions type stuff. So I'm particularly interested in the email example. Like, what behavior would be different if I used a lowercase I rather than an uppercase I on that input for the email example?
None. If you wanted to, Rezact absolutely lets you just do a basic HTML form that will submit on enter. So you can go all the way back to the original, just use the browser. In fact, Rezact is only involved in that example with the email in the fact that it's wrapped in that capital F form. And so when you hit submit, it is running some JavaScript to grab the values from your form, turn it into a JSON object that you can then do whatever you want with, right? Because like in a client-side rendered app, that's how you do that. You grab a JSON blob, you ship, send a request off to the server, get a response, do something to update the UI. That's all completely optional with Rezact. You don't have to do any of that. And Rezact will get out of your way. If you never use hardly any of these functions, and the only thing that you're really doing is just basic HTML, your JSON bundle, JavaScript bundle that gets shipped to the client is just incredibly tiny. It's actually smaller than, Svelte 4. We'll see how Svelte 5 is. They're claiming that it's even smaller than Svelte. They're claiming Svelte 5 is smaller than Svelte 4. So we'll see when that actually comes out how much smaller it actually is, which is impressive because it's already pretty small.
So, well, I guess my number one question on that is, the number one gripe that I see people make that I think is a fairly legitimate gripe is that when you use required on an input, you can style an input to be almost whatever you want. There have been some quirks now and then with the autocomplete changing the font size back to the original font size, but I think that's mostly been worked out by the browsers by now. But the required has a pop-up that you can't, to my knowledge, today, you still can't customize the look and feel of the pop-up that you get with the required. And so it is, by default, is Rezact using that same required, or do you have some sort of custom pop-up that I can edit the CSS and make it look different?
Yeah, no, we're not using the built-in browser's validation display, if that's what you're referring to.
Yeah.
Because it's so painful. It's so hard to try to make that look the way you want it to look. And I have yet to meet a designer or a project manager that has ever just been okay with the default browser's validation when it comes to, form inputs. They all are like, nope, here's the design. You need to make it look like this when it validates. And so you have to do that.
I think that's a pity, though, because this is a luxury that Apple and Android developers get. You don't say, well, we're going to publish this as a native iPhone app, but we think iPhone sucks and everything it does is wrong. So we're going to redesign everything. Instead of looking like an iPhone app, it's going to look like something no one's ever seen before. But that seems to be that seems to be the more common approach to the browser, is like,
Yep.
everything about the browser is wrong. It all sucks. We're going to eliminate all the design that goes into Chrome, and rather than a Chrome user having a Chrome experience, we're going to give them some random experience that they've never had before, which I think
Yep.
is a real pity. Like, I agree that the validation pop-up is not the ideal for every single scenario. It's not like 90% of people want this as like the height of perfection. But I also, the other way around, I just have a hard time seeing 90% of people saying, "Oh, this is completely unusable. This doesn't communicate anything valuable to the user. It's too difficult to be understood. It'll just confuse people." I don't really see that either. So I get the argument for wanting to have it be custom, but I also think that people just need to calm down a little bit and treat it more like they would an iOS app and say, you know what, Apple did research into this, they figured it out. We're not going to rewrite every single component that Apple ever created. And likewise, the Chrome team, they've done some research, they've done a decent job. It's not bad. And unless it's like really part of your, and also this isn't even on the happy path, right? I mean, you're talking about somebody types in a phone number wrong.
Yep.
Do they need it to be in your company colors in order for them to understand that they need to fix a missing digit?
Yep. No, I actually went down this path with it was supposed to be just a simple form. And my job is about like sometime last year. And I was like, well, it's just a simple form. 90% of the time, these people are just going to fill it out right the first pass. Well, my, quality and PM and designer, they get involved and they start poking at it. And they're like, well, this is what happens when I don't do it right, when I do it wrong intentionally. I don't like the way that looks. I don't like the way that feels. I don't like the way that works. Can you change it to do it? All this custom stuff. And so that's where that came from, was exactly that. I'm like, okay, all right, that's, I guess, how this is going to go. And to be fair, I haven't used Rezact in that application, but I am using the same. I ended up creating the validation engine for that project that I'm now using also in Rezact. So it's like a completely custom, from the ground up written validation and masking engine. And you can do...
Go ahead.
Well, and you can do exactly what we're talking about as far as, designing and CSS your error messages and how they display, when they display, how they display, all of that to your heart's content. But absolutely disabling the browser's native responses to those validations.
So with the examples that you gave here, I think they're actually really, really good examples to bring up some talking points. I love the idea of the mask. Like from the idyllic perspective, like we live in the world of fairy tales and rainbows. Couldn't we just provide a mask equals, like you show here in the example, and everything just works and is wonderful? And in the most simplistic case, like, what you've showed here, it seems like that could work. If all we're going to ever accept is US phone numbers, then we can use this mask as you've defined it, which is the case for most people in the United States. Most people, like, they might have in their heads they're going to scale to international, but they're not.
Yep.
Right? So this is actually, like, it's really convenient. It communicates really effectively. Like, so much about the experience of this in the ideal world is perfect. Like, what more could we ask for? So for people that are listening audio, it's parentheses with underscores in between, a space, some underscores, a space, some underscores. And I'm imagining what that means is that the underscore means that as the user types, it's going to fill in the value so that the value will be visible to the user as they type with that formatting and spacing.
Yep. And, if anybody's, on the site, just below that code example is the actual form. And you can see that in action as you type in the phone number field.
Oh, I didn't even notice.
Yep.
Yeah. But then it's like, okay, well, realistically, we're only going to be doing US, email address or phone number. So we could let that one slide, that it's not going to handle 200 different formats for phone number, because we're practical, right?
Yeah.
We're not having a delusion that we're going to go planet scale with our with our startup app here. Okay.
Yep.
But now the next one is the one where it breaks utterly, because I am going to have people that have Visa, Discover, and American Express. So your credit card validator has the 16 dots, and do the dots mean that it turns into an asterisk as they type, or it stays a dot, or what does the dot mean there? It says mask and mask slots.
So it actually is the dots in this particular case, the mask slots. So it's saying, the dots are the placeholder, is what those end up being for when you type in a number. And so it doesn't actually display anything while you type. It just shows the numbers. And then as you type, you'll see the space, be inserted as you type.
Okay. Now I'm trying it out. Okay.
And then, and so you see the min length is 15 and the max is 16. And I actually work in payments, and it's all US based payments that we currently work with merchants in the US. We don't work with international merchants. So we have been doing 15 to 16 digit card inputs as long as they've been in business. And that has not been there's never been a request so far from someone saying, well, hey, I need you to accept the 19-digit version or the 20-digit version, because there's new standards that are coming out about how we may end up with card numbers that are longer than that.
Oh no.
The validation for the actual check will actually work with either the 15-digit version for American Express or the 16-digit version for Visa, MasterCard, and Discover. The algorithm that's used to basically validate a card number is very, very simple.
It's like CRC 32 or something.
Yeah, it's basically something along them lines. Yeah. And so it's not even actually telling you that the card number is real. It's just telling you that it passes that check and it could be real. And so you submit it. And then from there, it goes through the card network brands and all that. And then they actually will return a response if it's real or not.
So, but the mask, I think there's 3 different formats for a credit card. If I don't remember off the top of my head, but American Express starts with 5 digits.
Yep.
Visa does 4. Visa, Maestro, Master all do 4, and then Discover I don't remember. Is it 4 or 5? Anyway, so but the point is, like, realistically, this mask value breaks down really quickly, because now, if I wanted to display somebody's American Express card, it's going to mask it in a weird way that's unfamiliar to them, right?
Yep. So in this example, you're absolutely right. It will break right away. In our card fields that we have where I work, we do extra work to detect that first digit. I think it's 3. And it's like, if it's 3, it's American Express. And so we will update the mask to fit that format. As soon as you hit that first keystroke, you hit 3. Now, this example isn't going to do that, but in our other fields at work, that's how that works. You hit 3 and it changes the format of the mask.
So my question there is, when you look at a situation like this, I know that for the purpose of an example, everybody wants to see this cute little example that does a bunch of magic, but like the reality starts to break things down pretty quickly. I don't know how many types of inputs where like the way you've shown it here, which is so idyllic, like this is what I wish we could have, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how many inputs there are that actually are simple enough that they can work this way. So my question is, do you think that it is like, is there really a significant advantage to striving for this kind of template like syntax that, it looks so good, versus just do it in JavaScript 90% of the time?
That's a great point, because you're right. Obviously, with the American Express example, that's what we're talking about, right? Is now it's no longer this nice example. Mask equals, 16 dots with spaces is no longer mask equals 16 dots with spaces. It's mask equals a signal, and then you're updating that signal based on, and now you've got an on-change event or an on-input event where you're looking at while they're typing and deciding which mask to show. So you're right. There is a breakdown there, But I really like personally the option to start here. And then once I'm beyond or running into the issues, I'd like to have something that facilitates that process of customization more easily. And I think there is here, and I'm just not showing it. Like, I think the ability to move from this really idyllic, simple example into the complex scenarios that you're going to run into once you start actively having users use your stuff, I think is actually available. Like, you could really easily move from, just from the simplistic example of handling the American Express mask. It's not out of reach in this framework.
Okay, well here's another thought that I just thinking of. There's a number of things that are very finite, right? Like everybody has to do them, and there's very little variation in how we want to do them, even if we're really artistically expressive, right? Like
Yep.
the error message falls a little bit outside of that bounds because people just want to be so freaking artistically expressive. But displaying a phone number or a credit card, we literally have a list of internationalization for this, right? Like there are standards that specify this is the American way to format a phone number, this is the European way to format a phone number, and there's not thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or an infinite number of ways that you could want to do it. There's, I don't know, on the small end, like 3 or 4, and on the big end, maybe a dozen or 2. And then same thing with the credit card. That's even more constrained. Like these credit card companies, how they format their card is part of the brand, and it's basically you're down to, do you want spaces, do you want dashes? So what do you think about taking the opposite approach, saying, you know what? It's a shame that browsers haven't decided on, type equals credit card. What about just bringing that full on into the primitive of the system to say, hey, validator input handles credit card as a type of input, and it handles phone number as a type of input, and your option is you pass in the, do you want the space or do you want the dash? Do you want the mask the last 4, or do you want to unmask the last 4, or do you want to unmask the whole thing? Like,
Yep.
I mean, there's literally, for credit cards, there's literally a PCI document that, I mean, you know this because you like there's a PCI document that tells you what your options are. So you have a finite number of options that you could just say, I want it this way or that way, and be done with it, and not have the artistic expression and not have to go and to do it in JavaScript, like I said.
Oh, I would love that. Like, I think if there was a way to standardize this and have the browsers support these various, permutations of the way that people are trying to do inputs, especially in forms, then I would use it. But I don't know what that looks like. Like,
well,
how?
No, I mean, like you in your own framework, like what if you just update your validator input and say, hey, one of the key features is that we support something that every single business on the planet wants, the ability to put in a credit card.
Sure. Yeah, I could easily create a. I can imagine as you're talking how I could use. And by the way, I should actually step back and clarify that a lot of the code that is in this isn't actually framework specific to Rezact. This is code that I could port to, and I have. It's actually currently existing in my work infrastructure code.
God bless you.
Is just a basic library, right? So there's nothing special about this code that makes this happen. And so as you're sitting here talking, I can imagine how I could create a component that would handle all of what you're saying as far as the internationalization. I think there's some question marks around like, well, what do you want that to look like? Should it auto detect as you type? Should you be able to select your prefix or whatever, and then that automatically updates and changes the format, things of that nature. So there's some questions around what that should look like, but I can imagine how I could make a component or an input that would handle that you could consume and say, hey, here's this component that does phone numbers. which is kind of wild because we're geared to just download an npm package for stuff like that. And so I can imagine there might even be an npm package for a component for a phone number input. I bet if we just did a quick search right now, we'd find one.
I'm sure we'd find dozens, but
Yeah.
Finding one that works reliably and that doesn't require having a particular, finding something that just works the way the browser works.
Yep.
That I think is not going to be as popular as like an entire UI kit, right? Yeah. And that's what I'm talking about. Is like, if I can style an input and you can just put the stuff in the input, yeah. And I the question about, well, one thing that I hate, that I absolutely hate, and it looks like you've taken care to solve in what you've created, is if I can't paste in a value. Like I paste in something that has dashes where it expects dots, or dots where it expects dashes, and then it just like pastes in 2 characters and then stops, and it pastes them in wrong because it has like the leading one, so it's like 180, and then it stops.
I'm dying. I hope that worked. Did it work? You were able to paste in a number with dashes, and that worked.
I didn't try. I'll try it right now.
Right now. I'm dying. Oh, I'm like curious to see what happens here.
We're all on the edge of our seats waiting for AJ's copy paste test.
Let's see. Okay, so it did do the wrong thing if it starts with a 1, but your example didn't. If I just paste in with dashes, yes, it works. If I don't put the leading one, it works. And I'm going to try with dots as well and see how that goes. Works. So, like, that's the only thing that I would wish differently is that it kept the leading or the trailing character, so that when I go back to delete the 1, that it kept the trailing 5.
Gotcha. Yeah. So there's some work there to be done.
I mean that's good. That's better than the experience of 99 point.
Masking is so hard. Like it is one of the hardest things to do right. And I'm not going to sit here and say that I did it right because I don't know. We're talking about dashes and dots now, whether or not those work in pasting, and that's the first time I've ever thought to test for that. It's definitely a very, very difficult thing to implement, especially like from scratch in JavaScript.
So with Rezact, it sounds like this is something that, you're not necessarily saying, hey, I think that this is going to be the next hot framework. This is something that has personally brought you value, has brought value to your clients, and that you're not sure if it brought value to your clients.
Well, I don't have any clients that I've used the framework with. So that's just so far. This is a 0 user framework. I've got, a Discord channel where some people were playing with it. And I think there's one guy who was really interested in, using it in a production app that he was, had a vision for, but I'm one guy. And I tried to talk to him. I was like, hey, if you really are passionate about this and want to see this work, let's get together, let's develop it and try to engage the community to, participate. But he was like, no, I'm not. He's like, I want you to do it, all the work, and then I'll just use it. I'm like, okay, well, I can't make you any promises. So yeah, we have, as far as I know, 0 users of this framework.
Okay, all right. So
that's because you want to use async await then instead of promises. Is that it? Or
What's
as far as the yeah.
Oh, now I get it. Okay, so what's the moral of the story then? Because you did something interesting. You tried out some stuff. You created something that seems to be of, pretty high value in terms of, well, value we'd have to throw that to the market to see what the market decides the value of it is. But it seems like it's high quality.
Thank you.
So, but what's the moral of the story with this? You created a framework, and then what?
So, I just, from the time that I last wrote any code for this and committed, I got just slammed. I'm super busy, and so I haven't had any time to dedicate to the project, but it is my intention to continue building on this and using it at the very least in my own personal projects. It's something that I find useful. So for sure, there's value there just in that regard. There has been some people who have expressed interest, and so there may be some value. But is my goal right now to take over, become the next React or the next Svelte or anything of that nature? I'm not that grandiose. I'm having a lot of fun building it and playing with it. And if other people find joy in it, then that's just icing on the cake.
So what's the most valuable thing about this experience to share with our listeners?
Oh, honestly, the most valuable thing, is just the act of trying to build something like a framework. You go through all of the mental gymnastics that many smarter people than me before me had to go through to come up with stuff like this. And so you get a really valuable insight into the process. And you only get that if you try to build your own front-end framework. And so that's what this started out as. And the fact that it became somewhat valuable to me was an accident, to be completely honest. And yeah, that's the takeaway. Like, I'm just struggling with the same struggles, at least some of them, that framework authors today have to struggle with. And it brings you a level of maybe compassion for some of those authors, because a lot of them are not getting paid to do any of that. Well, and I'm not getting paid to do any of that either. So,
so let me see if I can summarize this. I've been listening to you and AJ talk for a while, and reading through the docs and all this, and I'm looking at a lot of the stuff you mentioned. I see already done in Vue, for instance. I'll give you an example. Reactive computations.
yep.
So the gist is you have an underlying, say, a data set or a value. It could be a scalar value, it could be an array, it could be, you name it, right? And then you have a top level variable that returns some value from it, whether it's the entire array, whether it's, you're adding two numbers together, 2 plus X, is going to. And so the way that you describe it in there is that you're behind the scenes, you're handling any changes. You're only going to re-render the value when something changes. So if you go to, your page loads and it hasn't changed, then in other words, you're using a cached value. Almost is the way you look at it, because Vue uses computed values, and that's exactly what this does. I'm reading this and I'm going, this sounds like a lot like a Vue computed value behind the scenes.
Yep.
But the overall gist I'm getting in is specifically if you look at the stores page, where you're talking about what you do with Rezact as compared to Redux React, right? And you've got you set up the store, you create actions in your reducers, provide Redux store to React, and all this kind of stuff. So the gist I'm getting, and tell me if this is an accurate overall statement, as we sort of wrap up here, is that you're basically using the platform and doing a lot of the stuff that other frameworks have to implement other tools to do the same thing. Is that a fair statement?
There's a lot of that, yes, and including this idea that you're looking at with the stores. It's baked in. It's actually the same thing as using a signal or inside a component. It's actually the exact same code. So there's no new mechanism that I've created in the actual core of the framework to enable stores. It's the same code that you use to create signals everywhere.
Okay. Yeah, I'm noticing that most of your examples are in comparison to React. So, and obviously we talked about ahead of time about the naming, it's Rezact. I mean, from a historical standpoint in your development history, did you start out doing React and you were saying, I don't like all this, the way React's doing stuff, so I'm going to create a more simple and more efficient way to do it? Was that the driving force behind this?
It's a bit of that. It's a bit of that, and I'd say because I've played with a lot of the frameworks, I've played with Svelte and Solid, and unfortunately, I can't say that I've played with Vue as much. A long time ago, when Vue was first starting, I think I played with it, but it's been a long time since I've done that. And so I saw what other frameworks were doing, and I've done React a lot in my daily job, and there was just things that as I've written React where I was like, man, it'd make me think of Svelte and how Svelte handled something.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like,
yeah, I see a lot of Svelte in here.
Yeah. And that was exactly a lot of the inspiration was like, I want JSX, I want function components, but I also want Svelte. And so that's really where this, I guess inspiration came from.
So why not just use Svelte? Why do this instead of using Svelte?
In particular, Svelte, doesn't really use JSX. It's using its own, language. Really, it's like a whole language.
Preprocessor on that?
In Svelte or in React?
And so my understanding is that JSX is just syntax sugar. Like if you ran a preprocessor on a JSX file, you'd end up with a file that just has like template strings and a couple of functions added to it. I could be completely wrong about that. I mean, this may be absolutely wrong, but my understanding was like basically it's just doing string escaping for you.
So in this particular case, the transpilation, so I'm using Vite and it's using whatever it uses. I'm not 100% versed in the whole underlying structure, but I've created a plugin basically that will transform very specifically things surrounding these keywords that I have as far as like, oh, it's a $sign, it's a variable, it's actually looking at the AST syntax to try to pick up on a lot of that stuff. And it will pick up on it and then make the transformations. And it's literally just rewriting the code. So it's like, oh, you're assigning a value to this variable that was assigned earlier or created earlier. Okay, well, I'm going to do a setter here. Oh, you're going to read this value here. Oh, I'm going to do a getter here. That's what the transpilation is. And that actually happens after the JSX gets compiled into, code that can be read by the browser. So it's like, if from a step standpoint, Rezact doesn't do anything until after the JSX has been transpiled. Okay. And then the plugin picks up after that and it parses that code to look for these dollar variables, and I think I've got a couple keywords in here too that it looks for.
But you don't feel like that could be done in Svelte? You couldn't just run a preprocessor step on Svelte and then have it run its processor
maybe
after the
I probably could, but then I'd have missed out on all the fun of starting from scratch.
I think that there's value in that. I think that we don't need everyone to publish their own framework, but we might do well to have people kind of do a Hello World framework or something like that. Yeah. Take that path and gain some of the. It's not so much. You speak to this. I haven't created my own framework yet, but maybe it's not so much magic as it seems. Like maybe it's more approachable than we're led to believe.
I think that just depends on your level of experience, because if you're a beginner, I would not recommend you set out to build a, JSX framework. But if you've been using React for a while and you understand React well enough, then no, I don't think you could have any problem. In fact, I'm sure that I started with an article that I found online. It was like, build your own React framework. I'll try to find that link and then post it somewhere, but it was a long time. It's been over a year now since I read that article. And I don't know if I actually used the article to do it or if it just inspired me like, oh, this is approachable. And I just kind of saw some of the pieces and I'm like, well, how hard can it be? I don't have to write a JSX parser or transpiler because that's already done. all I have to do is write a framework that can handle the code generated by the JSX output of the the transpiled output of the JSX. And it's like create element is like the first function you write, that because that's what JSX gets transpiled into, is a bunch of create element calls and things of that nature. So I'd say more approachable than probably a lot of people think, but not approachable for like someone just starting to learn.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that's fair. All right. Well, thanks for coming on the show. This has been enjoyable and enlightening, and I'm glad that you were able to share your experience. Is there any last thing you think, man, I want to get to this next time, but give people a teaser for this time?
No, actually, I feel like I covered a lot, even more than I had planned and prepared to cover. So I feel pretty good.
All right, great. Well, then we will go ahead and head into picks, which is just where we give a short or 15-minute long snippet about something that we're into recently. And we'll go ahead and let Steve start us off with that. Steve, do you have some picks for us, or?
The usual high point of every episode, my dad jokes of the week. Didn't really have anything else on the mind to share with today. So, Zach, I don't know if you listen to the podcast, but I had people begging me to tell more dad jokes. Just kidding. Really, I don't. Anyway, so question. What kind of car does a sheep drive? A Lamborghini. Just kidding. Sheep can't afford a Lambo. They just take a Uber. It's a long time ago. I used to have a dog. I had a legless dog, and his name was Cigarette because every morning I took him out for a drag. And then finally, where's my mouse going? I'd like to say welcome to the Plastic Surgery Addicts Group. I see a lot of new faces here today.
Nice.
That one was good. That one was good.
Yeah.
And the dog one too. You had a lot of good ones today.
Yeah. You have
either I'm getting more used to it and my expectation of quality of humor is declining, or you're getting better, but I'm not sure which one.
I think it's just probably you're getting numb, AJ, is what it is.
I liked it. I enjoyed it. I actually got some genuine laughs out of those. So, but I'm also a dad. I don't have as many dad jokes. I don't have any dad jokes to say today, but that was fun.
All right, that's all I got.
All right, I will pick. Did I mention last time that I've been listening to the Andromeda Strain?
Yes, I believe so. I remember that discussion from previous.
I really did enjoy the book. It's written in 1969. It's aged fairly well, other than that computers, of course, still today can't do any of what they do in the book, but it's written with that little bit of extra belief about computers being able to do more than they can. It works. It works. It's I would say that its use of computers as part of the plot, which is, they're not like a major part of the plot. It's just, secret government research facility and the computers can do all this stuff. I think that it's fairly timeless and has aged well. And in another 200 years, computers still won't be able to do those things, but people will still believe that we're right on the cusp. And the one thing about the book is that it just ended. And then I was like, wait, what? Did it skip a chapter? And this is a lot of people's experience. The ending of the book is a sentence. Which it needs a little bit more than that. It's like a sentence for the ending of the book and then the epilogue. And that, yeah, it just...
Sort of like the Sopranos or that type of thing? Or?
I don't know. I didn't watch The Sopranos,
the famous black screen where everything just stops.
I don't know about it, but just the ending was completely unsatisfying because the book has all this buildup, it has all this, the plot thickens, it has all this, and if only they had known a few hours before, this hypothesis was completely incorrect. And then when they get to the end of the book, it's like, and this coincidental thing happened, and all is well. And it's like, oh. But that said, Michael Crichton's cranked out a lot of books, a lot of them pretty darn good. And Andromeda Strain, I think I'd say is worth the listen or the read. And I don't know, hopefully, I think I spoiled the ending already by saying that it ends in a sentence. Because I was like 3/4 of the way through the book, and I'm like, man, this is a lot to wrap up. How are they going to tie this all together?
They don't.
They don't have to.
And they don't.
It's just like, well, I mean, but that's real life too. I mean, real life often has unsatisfying endings to projects. You spend 3 weeks. I mean, like as a web developer or whatever, this, right? You spend 3 weeks investigating a technology, thinking that you're going to switch databases and use the latest framework,
Yep.
and then it turns out that all you needed to do was type equals email on the input field. So
Very true. Yeah, I'll have to check that out. I haven't read any Michael Crichton in a long time, actually. So I think I'm due.
I don't know if he's come out with anything in a long time. I don't know if he's still alive. I don't know what his age was or anything. But
Yeah.
I loved Jurassic Park, although I think that they did the movie better than the book. Not that the book was not done well.
Yep.
John Hammond is a much more relatable character in the movie. And there's just a few things that they're just done better in the movie. Just like with the Hunger Games, there's a few things. I wouldn't say that the movie is better than the book in the Hunger Games. Like I would say, the movie was refined for Jurassic Park. In the Hunger Games, the movie's telling another side of the story that you don't get from the perspective of the narration. But yeah, I like a lot of his stuff. I think it's done well. I might pick up some more at some point, although I've got a backlog of like 20 books to read/listen to, so I canceled my Audible subscription indefinitely until I can actually work through that stuff. But anyway, why don't you give us a couple of your picks, Zach?
Well, I just have one for today. Recently, because I don't even really have time anymore, I feel like to engage in leisure activities as far as reading books and even watching some TV. But I did find some time just to take a break and watch this show that caught my eye called, it's on Netflix, A Man in Full. It's got Jeff Daniels in it. Does that ring a bell, anybody? I think it's relatively new, like maybe just came out like even this year.
I mean, obviously I know who Jeff Daniels is, but haven't. I think I've heard about it or seen it mentioned. I'm not familiar with it.
So it's basically, he's a real estate mogul in I think Georgia. And, he's like this big to do. He's got, lots of real estate in this big building, but, he may be a little bit shady, but he also employs some really nice people. And so it's got, some side stories where, like his lawyer struggles because he's actually a nice guy and really would like to be doing something a little more holistic as opposed to just defending this real estate mogul who maybe has some shady business practices. But and so there's like a whole side story in the episode where he fights for this guy's freedom that I don't want to give too much away because it's actually a pretty good side story. And the main story is like, okay, but I think I really liked the side story better. Like, I think I committed to watching the rest of it and was, kept coming back to see the rest of it. It's a mini series, so it's not very long. Was this side story of this lawyer and how he helped this gentleman basically through like some legal troubles. So I don't want to give away too much, but really good. Recommend it. I think it's a fun watch.
Is it like an ongoing series, miniseries type thing, or
no? It's based on the book by Tom. I'm looking now. I can't remember what the author's name was. And it's based on a book, Tom Wolfe. So it's based on the book by Tom Wolfe named A Man in Full. So I don't think it's going to be a continuing thing. It's a mini series, and
okay.
so I think that's it. Which is something that I find that I'm leaning toward lately, because I just don't have the commitment space to engage in series that are ongoing anymore. Like I feel
Right.
like I'm like already beyond season whatever 1, 2, or 3 of things that I want to watch, and I'm like, I don't have time to catch up.
I really wish they would just focus on a story that has a beginning and an end, and not artificially drag out seasons of things forever and ever. Because eventually they just like
Become the same thing. Like
there's no character development, because once the main guy gets with the main girl, at that point
Yep.
all that tension is gone, and then they keep it going for another 3 seasons by having them separate and then get back together again, and it's there's
Yep.
Yeah, that's sort of the if you're familiar with Mexican telenovelas, that's their approach, right? It's a there's a beginning and an end. It's not like As the Stomach Turns that's been going for 30 years, or something like that, where they tell the same story over and over. It's just a different twist. It's like, okay, here it starts, here it ends, it's done, and then to be honest, then they do a whole new telenovela that's sort of like the previous one with different plot twists, so it depends on your variation.
Yeah.
well, there's so many shows that could be great if they would just end them 6 or 20 seasons earlier.
Right.
Like, give me 1, 2, 3 seasons. Maybe 4 is like a reprise or a bonus or a year in the life. But don't give me 8 seasons. Like, just give me a good story.
Yep.
Yeah, one of my faves was on Amazon was the John Krasinski, Jack Ryan series.
Yeah.
I loved those series. Those are so good. The third one was a little weak, but the first 2 were really good.
Yeah.
And they were just like, I think it was 8 episodes, start, done, end of the storyline, and then it come back. And I think this third one is supposedly the last one. But that was great. I was hooked on those things, man. I'd be sitting at night watching them on my phone, when I'm supposed to be in bed. But yeah, stuff like that is really good. So.
All right. Well, I should have switched the screen with Bob earlier when we were all chatting. Anyway, thanks for coming on. It's great to have you, and have a nice life.
Yeah.
Hopefully there's a good reaction to this episode.
Well, thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yep.
All right. And to all the listeners, thanks for tuning in. And I'll give you 15 seconds if you've got a burning something you need to say. Async validator is supported. Good. I don't know what that was in reference to anymore.
Yeah, that was a while ago.
All right. Well, thanks. And I guess we'll go ahead and click the end stream button.
All right. Adios.
Adios.